We're going to go live in 30 seconds.
Done. Recording is on.
All right, I'm muting myself. Okay, I don't need to mute. I need to give you a countdown.
Yeah.
Great. And we're live. Great. And we're live.
Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you. Welcome to the 4th edition of the Road to SheTrades Global, which is our 6-month capacity building program in advance of our annual event, SheTrades Global Dubai, scheduled in October. So far, we've touched upon different themes. In March, we spoke about ethical business practices. In April, we spoke about digitalization, and May was about unlocking finances. But today's topic is very, very relevant in these challenging times that we're facing, because today we want to understand how can businesses, take advantages of climate adaptation measures? How can they adopt more environmentally sustainable measures and lead the way to a more climate resilient economy? So before I pass the floor to my dear speakers, I think a very quick note on logistics for all of you. So we will be recording this webinar. So don't worry, you will have access to this at a later date as well. We would also request you to kindly share your feedback with us using an evaluation form that will be shared with you in the chat box. And as you know, the format that we follow in previous webinars, today will be a very technical hands-on session. But don't worry, we will come back with a panel session next week, and we request you to please save all your questions till then, because then we'll have our experts, women entrepreneurs, and everyone again. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our dear speakers for today. So our first speaker is Ms. Anne-Catherine Zotz. She is the manager for the Green to Compete initiative for the International Trade Center. Prior to joining ITC, she worked as a consultant on economy and trade for the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and for the Inter-American Development Bank in Santiago, Chile. She also holds a master's degree in applied economics, international trade, finance and development from the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics. And our second speaker for today is Ms. Annegret Pross, who is the coordinator for the Green to Compete initiative for the International Trade Center. And before joining ITC, she worked in the energy practice of Roland Berger in China, advising Chinese investors in their overseas investment decisions. She also holds a degree in business administration from Tübingen University and Chinese studies from the University of Oxford. So Anne-Catherine, Annegret, firstly, a big, big thanks to both of you. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I pass the floor to you two now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kriti, for this very nice introduction, for setting the scene as well. Today, we will be discussing, climate change, the big, let's say, challenge of all our times and its impacts, not only on the globe, but of course, your business. So we will dive into the question on climate risks, small and medium-sized enterprises, give you examples of how to adapt to climate change, and also introduce you to our very own climate resilience approach, where you will see on how to perhaps go about yourself to actually adapt to climate change and its impacts. So we start off with actually looking at a map. Perhaps many of you have seen of how climate has been evolving in the last 100 years, actually impacting every single region in the world, and really going stronger and stronger as we go through the different decades, ending up at a picture, and you see it already becoming more yellower and yellower to a picture which is completely red, and actually, in the last 5 years, this development just continued in having our globe really warming up, gradually over time. And what does that mean? So we see, and I've used the word already, gradual, that there's a gradual change happening. That means a change in the mean state of climate and its variability over the long run. So we have seen over the last 100 years a clear trend towards a warmer climate. And that, of course, is directly linked to the greenhouse gas effect. That means our atmosphere is warming up, leading to changes of our weather patterns, and that means differences in temperatures, rainfall, as well as climate events. And then we have the extreme weather events, hurricanes, extreme droughts, also colds, which are happening irrespectively of the changing climate, but are even more extravagated by climate change. So yes, not all natural disasters are man-made. However, climate change is, and climate change is making those extreme weather events more extreme and more frequent. So we have these two differences in how climate is impacting our globe. And what are the consequences? Well, we have defined 5 different areas. Of course, the weather, very clear consequence, or changing pattern in the weather is a clear consequence of climate change. So we see storms being more violent. We see forest fires. We had the famous fires in the Amazon, which were really very well covered throughout the media, prolonged droughts, floods, as well as heat waves. Then, of course, also our water systems are influenced, water and sea. So we have a threat and a pressure on actually our water resources, and especially with sweet water resources, which have led and are expected to lead further to a shortage of water resources. And then, of course, also seeing already cities impacted by sea level rise. And in this graph, you see by a change in climate, which gets more extreme from 1 to 5 degrees, also the let's say impact is worsening. Yeah, while with a one degree increase already, we see certain impacts on our globe. When we go further to a 2 to 3 degree impact, it gets even more extreme. So then on the agriculture systems, we already see much lower crop yields for countries around the equator, but of course also for any other country impacted through changing weather patterns where seasons are changing. And so also the availability of food, for example, is changing throughout the different seasons, again, leading in some countries already to shortages. And we would see when we go along this graph in the scenario of 3 to 4%, 4 degrees, even a lower crop yields for countries which are actually far away from the equator, which we don't see yet, but it is a possible outcome. Our ecosystems are under pressure. We have more loss in biodiversity, which is extravagated again, not only caused by human mankind, but extravagated by man-made climate change. And that has led already now to a considerable number of species being extinct, and that is only a trend we see continuing along as we are going to warm up even further. And then finally, an impact on populations, rise of disease. I think this current COVID pandemic, of course, is not an immediate impact from climate change, but definitely also again linked to our, let's say, influence in the world's ecosystems. And as we are going along, we would also see climate change causing more diseases and hence also more people migrating away from highly impacted areas. And that might cause then, when we go towards a, let's say, a high degree scenario, also even to conflict and what we had seen already in the past. So that is basically setting the scene, and hence a call for action, which comes right after. We have still some time left. Perhaps not even any more 10 years, no, as we are moving ahead, but definitely between, let's say, 5 and almost 10. And we need to adapt. If we don't adapt, and that is basically also, again, different scenarios appear, the climate impacts with global warming of only 1.5 degrees have already devastating effects, but much lesser to 2 degrees. And if we adapt, we can actually mitigate certain impacts. The global warming, which is not anymore to halt, can have on our, let's say, economies as well as on our companies. So adapting to climate change has a lot of different advantages for SMEs, for small and medium-sized enterprises. It ensures continuity of your business by taking actually measures against negative impacts. It allows, let's say, stable value chains to continue to work. Yeah, you supplying, for example, your buyers. It can also lead to lower operation costs by using, for example, natural resources more efficiently. Also, it can give you then a competitive advantage by being, for example, more efficient, more productive, and also investing into innovative measures. And we will give you a range of examples. That's why I will not mention them now. Develop actually new ranges of products adapted to the changing climate. Improve your company's reputation by communicating actually that you are already now adapting to a changing climate and anticipating new regulations in relation to climate change. And we have seen already many different, let's say, laws or policies being passed in order to meet, let's say, the Paris Agreement by governments. These are more and more trickling down also to the private sector, and we're just expecting more regulations to kick in the next years. So how do we go about it? We have developed a climate resilience approach to support SMEs in actually understanding and adapting to a changing climate. This is a 4-step approach, and we will go into more depth as we go along. So we start with an analysis of actually the climate hotspots in a given sector. And actually that doesn't only work within this approach, but actually it helps you as a company to already go ahead and understand basically where are the climate hotspots within your sector, as well as the value chain you're connected to. We have developed an SME diagnostic on the climate change readiness to understand how prepared your company is in order to deal with climate change impacts. Then the climate expert approach, a tool developed by GIZ and further then implemented by ITC. This we will go into more, describe in more depth in a few slides. And finally, an online training, which we actually invite you to all take part in. And we have again a final slide on that one. Just already saying now, it starts 28th of June. It's for free, now available in English on the ITC SME Trade Academy. A few words more later. So you have 4 steps, let's say, approach here, which we step by step will get you acquainted with, and for which you can already take action yourself, even if you're not, let's say, inscribed within an ITC program. So understanding the hotspots, it's very important. And we have here an example of Nepal, and you will see in the next slides always the Nepal as being an example, because we want to make very practical of what it means. That means we understand what are actually the changes in temperature, for example, in your country, which might affect also your own sector. So for example, in Nepal, we looked into how are minimum and maximum temperatures going to be influenced, and the, let's say, research here done by the World Bank showed 1 to 3 to 3 to 8 degrees actually is the range in which the climate will change. And you remember a few slides ago, what could be the impact when we are going towards a scenario of an increase between 1 and 3 degrees. It's already massive, and hence we have to take action. And also what is interesting that, warming is expected to occur more rapidly during dry months. That means we have actually a seasonality much more pronounced, especially in the dry month, than ever before, which then, of course, again, can negatively impact, for example, certain crops in the country. And then winters are projected to be drier and monsoon summers wetter. Again, a change in the seasonality, which is common or understood so far in the country. So understanding firstly on a country level what is happening, on a sector level what is happening within the regions you are producing or your companies are located is just the first step. A very nice source also of, let's say, temperature, and that's why we want to mention it here, is actually by the Berkeley Earth. institute. So you can go on Berkeley Earth, can Google basically, or yeah, Google it, and then you can enter your country there. Even they have some city-related data, and you will see how was the change in climate over time. That is accessible for anyone for free. Hence, we wanted to highlight it to you because it gives you a very first insight in how to analyze the climate situation in your country and how have been recent changes. No. Another one, or another very important aspect is also understanding your country's national plans. We have two different ones which are very important in terms of climate change, which are the national adaptation plans, the so-called NAPs, which had to be formulated in order for countries to respond to the adaptation efforts set forth by the Paris Agreement, and the nationally determined contributions, which are actually looking in how to reduce CO2 emissions or greenhouse gases in your country. So again, here an example of Nepal. These documents are publicly available. You can download them, you can read them, and you can also check if there are industry-specific chapters or sector-specific chapters which would affect actually your industry. And there you will also see, in most of the cases, already an anticipation of regulation and policies the country is thinking of to put in place in the next years, and which might affect your business as well. So it's a very informative report. Mostly it's written with an executive summary, which you can, of course, go for first through, and then with much more detailed chapters afterwards. So we would encourage also in this very first step of understanding your country's situation to go through those. And then, of course, it's very important also to go much more, let's say, into detail and look at what are actually the climate scenarios for your own, let's say, crops or sectors. So here again, an example, as we said, we stick with the example of Nepal with the coffee and banana sector. And what is very interesting is here, you see completely different scenarios for the two crops within the same country. So coffee, here is the brown one, and banana, the yellow one. So over the different climate scenarios the research has put forward, A to I, you see that for coffee, basically, the suitability is decreasing in the country, while when you look at banana, it's actually increasing. And that's very important when you are thinking ahead of your sector, what is the potential of the sector in the future, and how much, well, productivity-wise also you can expect in the sector. Hence, looking per crop really makes a difference. So it's not only the national data, but going really per sector is very important. And again, of course, it's not always easy to find. In some countries, we have much less coverage than in others. You can see also, again, of course, with your government websites, if there are, let's say, repositories of that kind of information. We have here found a research we found very suitable for Nepal. In our own methodology, that's really something we would be offering as a service. However, of course, when this is not possible, we encourage anyone to get acquainted with it and to find suitable research and to really dive into it, as it's really making a difference to your own projections and forecasts for your own company's growth. So with that, we go to the next level. What does that all mean for your SME? Again, we talked very high level. We went from country level towards sectorial level. Still, it doesn't mean that you as an SME are impacted. Perhaps you have all different risks, and we want to look at how these risks can look like. So what is a risk to start with? A risk is defined by its magnitude, its likelihood, how frequent it could appear, a certain event, and of course your own company's vulnerability towards this event. So let's say we're looking at, for example, a flood. The flood might be really prolonged, several days in a row, making basically your company completely cut off any different routes. Yeah, we would call it a high magnitude event. Probability of this happening perhaps once a year. Yeah, with climate change, this probability might be increasing, but still, that's perhaps an event which occurs 1 or 2 times a year. Vulnerability-wise, though, it depends really on your own company. How prepared are you? Are you, for example, already prepared by, let's say, being just at the right spot within your own, let's say, location to not be affected, perhaps on the very, let's say, on an alleviated point within the location of the company? So warehouses, for example, are not affected. Did you for example, install flood barriers? Did you secure the routes? If this all didn't take place, your vulnerability might be very high. So it really depends on your company's situation in how much or how high is the risk towards a certain weather event or any sort of event. So climate change adaptation would help you manage and mitigate climate risks and, of course, also benefit from opportunities. And we would always recommend you to go through 5 different steps, from identifying the risk, assessing it, then comparing it also to different risks your company is facing or climate risks your company is facing, understanding which risks to prioritize, then put forward measures or countermeasures to respond to those risks, to actually mitigate them, and then later on, of course, to monitor the way you have been implementing your response measures and take perhaps also corrective action. So we differentiate very different types of risks. This go really around like value chain risks and external stakeholder risks. Specifically, we are looking at physical risks to your company. So for example, if a storm hits your company, takes the roof away, clear physical risk. Price risks, perhaps indirectly, water gets scarce because of a prolonged drought, the water price is increasing, or a price for water is introduced in your country, that would be an indirect risk. Your product or production might be impacted, that would be a product-related risks. And then we have the external stakeholder ones, which are really looking into how is your company impacted through, for example, ratings, reputation, as well as regulations set forth by your government. So it's important to understand, let's say, that there are different sources of those risks to also holistically, again, approach them and identify response measures which are suitable. So what is very important to keep in mind when we talk about climate change risk, the higher the likelihood of a negative effect. So the more frequent an event can occur. We talked about the flood. If it's happening instead of once a year, twice a year, that's already 100% more, then the higher the risk, of course. So when we go towards the, let's say, logical chain, we go from a climate change phenomena, for example, increased precipitation or rainfall, towards the next level, which would be the actual impact, the flooding, to the negative effect the flooding can have on your business. Then we look at likelihood, so how many times, how often can it happen, and the magnitude of it. Perhaps it's like, of course, a rain can happen many times a year. However, heavy rain, which actually then turns out to be a flood, perhaps less times a year. And that then lets you derive the risk. So on the one hand, the higher the likelihood of a negative effect, the higher the risks, and the same goes for the magnitude. The higher the magnitude of the negative effect, of course, the higher the risk as well. And so for any, let's say, phenomena, we can derive these 3 different categories. So when we take, for the example of a coffee cooperative, we have the phenomena of increase in intensity and frequency of rainfalls. This leads to an impact on the company, for example, the flooding of the coffee washing stations or the damage of roofs, or for example, disruption of roads. So you see already one phenomena can have different impacts and actually can have many more. This is just an example. There can be a list of 50 of those. And then the impact has a direct negative effect on your company. So the flooding of the coffee washing stations can then lead into an increase in the time needed to dry the coffee. Again, that of course can impact your relationship also with buyers and perhaps inhibit you from fulfilling contracts. And the disruption of the road connections, for example, can lead to a negative effect on your company in terms of workers not attending shifts or delays in the transportation of coffee. So you see, for every impact, again, we can also have different negative effects. So it's almost like a pyramid. So you start with the phenomena, you go to the next level on the impact, and then you derive the negative effect of this impact for your company. Well, and with that, having painted rather the negative picture now, Annegret will take over with the opportunities actually, and also what you can do in terms of climate adaptation measures.
Yeah, thank you very much, and Catherine. Indeed, that's a good point to hand over, coming from the impact side to the what are the opportunities. And indeed, in climate adaptation, we really see many opportunities for companies. We've seen this in many different countries, in many different sectors. And so we really want to highlight that climate change is happening, it's impacting on us, but let's not only see the negative side of it, but let's really try to use this change, which is anyways happening, as an opportunity. So on this slide, you can see how the different opportunities for SMEs are linked to climate change adaptation. So from the first level, they can integrate climate risks as well as related costs in their business strategies. Through that, they can collaborate better, they communicate more with different stakeholders in international value chains. So for instance, with international buyers that may even sit in different countries, for them to even better understand what is actually happening where the products are produced actually. An even higher level of opportunity could be that climate change enables companies to diversify into new markets, to new suppliers, to new clients, for instance. So let's say you're active in a specific crop. Maybe another crop is actually more suitable to be produced where you are, and this could enable you to produce new products. Maybe also consumer demands are changing. Maybe weather patterns are changing, asking for new types of products. So these are all very local, local adjustments that companies can realize, but they are there, and it's about being attentive and seeing how can climate change actually be used to the benefit of myself. And that, in the end, this is the next level, can of course increase the innovation that can happen in a company if managed in the right way. So really, these new types of opportunities for companies, it then goes all the way down to new climate finance, to, for instance, specific type of insurances that are being offered, to new technologies and new products that are available. So this is really an area where we see a lot of development as a reaction to those initially, to what was initially thought of as a risk. And so basically, we have listed on this slide different business opportunities as well as competitiveness, competitive advantages. So I've already said there might be new markets and new products. It could also really be an internal opportunity in the company that allows you to increase your productivity, for instance, due to more favorable climate conditions. Not necessarily a climatic condition per se, but for instance, if a company is impacted so heavily that it's installing better insulation as an effect, that of course will not only have the effect that it's less hot in the production premises, but this will also contribute to worker welfare. So these are also, of course, not the main targeted effects maybe, but they're also very positive side effects. In terms of competitive advantage, we have also seen many companies that use the opportunity of implementing adaptation measures as an avenue to, on the one hand, reduce their costs. So for instance, when they upgrade from one technology to the other, and we will have examples of that later on, there might be cost reductions that come in that. There might be an initial investment in the first year, but it will amortize throughout the years, so that actually this might be a reduction overall. The other side are reputational gains among key stakeholders. This is really also something that we have noted in our projects, that suppliers and international value chains, for instance, that say we make climate change, climate adaptation a priority for the company, for our employees. This really has reputational effects on the companies. So we've connected also with their buyers, for instance, and they were really impressed by the initiatives that their suppliers are actually undertaking in this area, and they engaged through this in more conversations with them, established stronger relationships. So also on this side, there could be an advantage. The next thing is more on the skill side for specific employees. New challenges always come with new knowledge, new types of ways to address these challenges. And that, of course, has an impact on the skills that is required from people working in the companies. So it's not only about the knowledge, but if a new technology has to be handled, that might be something that one specific employee does. And that skill can also help that employee for more opportunities, to have learned something new, to basically broaden the horizon. And then finally, another area related to the competitive advantage of a company is in relation to regulation and related policies. So also what we see more and more in the international sphere is that national policies are being adapted. We had, first of all, the Paris Accord, where companies agreed on, yes, this is a target, the 2-degree target or 1.5-degree target. And now it's up to specific countries to implement this target in their national regulations. And so we see that different countries are now really making this very practical, that they are implementing, on the one hand, requirements that companies have to adhere to, for instance, in relation to supply chain due diligence. But on the other hand, that there are also incentive policies that incentivize companies to make investments themselves, be it, for instance, in renewable energy, in relation to housing installation. And so really balancing these types of regulatory changes can also support the development of the companies per se. So with this, a lot of background on climate change, on what this means for companies. So let's go down to actual examples. What have different companies done? We already talked about that it's of course about when we're adapting a company's exposure, we're really reducing negative effects of climate change on the company. It's about managing risks, but it's also about opportunities, about thriving, and about company growth. So here is already, let's say, a list of measures that we have seen: better and efficient use of water resources, adapting building codes to future and extreme weather events. That could be, for instance, the roof. Anti-flooding measures, dikes, for instance, or in the agricultural sector, drought-resistant crops that might be impacted through drought. This is a long laundry list, right? You have so and so many things that you can do. So we have really thought about how can we classify them, and how can we try to go step by step to not just search anywhere in the company for what can be done, but to really have a guided approach for this. And we have come up with 3 types of adaptation measures. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you see the different categories. You have reactive adaptation measures, and that means in terms of the anticipation, that you're basically not anticipating what is coming up in the future due to climate change. You're simply saying, okay, we'll react when it arrives. That, of course, could have the effect that you're affected before you're able to react. So you first wait until things happen, and then you only say, oh, okay, now we need to put something in place. And that as a result for the measure, the adaptation measure, that says that, you're basically reacting afterwards, and you're trying to adjust, you're trying to minimize effects, whereas you might not be utilizing all the opportunities that come with it. On the other hand, if you go to the next level, you have anticipatory adaptation measures. So these are adaptation measures that you really plan in advance. And it says that in the name, anticipation. So you anticipate the changes and you prepare for what might be happening. This is sometimes difficult because you cannot necessarily know the extent of how this might happen. So you might know, okay, the number of heavy rains is increasing in my area. What does this mean now practically? You don't necessarily know, because you don't know how high the next flood is going to be. But you already know, okay, let's do something in that area, maybe where there are quick fixes that can be done in order to avoid the most negative impacts. So this would mean, in terms of the effect, that your company might still be affected if it is really a very extreme event, but you have, let's say, a minimum level of what could be done. And in terms of the measures, it's an improvement, such a measure, that you do on a single basis. So for instance, you implement a floodgate because you know that the river or the canalization where your company is placed might overrun with the next heavy rain. So that's, of course, one way. The most interesting way that we have seen with companies is the one which is called integrated adaptation. So this is an approach where you integrate the effects that you anticipate, the measures through that, into what you were anyways going to do as a company. And so through that, you prepare for the changes that might happen due to climate change, but you integrate them in your business strategy. And you do that with a really anticipatory point of view for the long-term development of the company. And for this, really, we see that companies might even benefit even more. So for instance, on the one hand, you might have heat impacts of climate change, but you might anyways plan as a company to redo the walls of the factory. So by integrating the effects, okay, that the walls of the factory need to be climate proof, whilst you anyways needed to or wanted to repair them, this can really be an approach to catch two birds with one stone. And this is really a strategic approach to climate adaptation. So now moving on to some very concrete examples that we have seen as part of the projects that we're implementing at the International Trade Center. And these examples are coming from different sectors, sometimes from agricultural sectors, but also from the manufacturing sector. So this first one here is from a tea factory in Kenya that we have worked with over the past 2 years. And in Kenya, what we have seen that the weather is changing at different fronts, but one of the phenomena here that has been pointed out is the heavy and prolonged rainfall, which can sometimes also be very erratic. So you might think, okay, now is a good weather, but actually the weather changes much faster than what you would have anticipated, or also it stays much longer so that the season actually changes. And this is also what we have seen in Kenya, that basically the seasonality of when usually we would have expected the rains to arrive and then the rains would have ended, this has really changed. So this company, the tea factory, processing tea leaves into really ready-made tea, they're using a lot of firewood in order to, in the tea drying process. And let's say the quality of the wood really depends also on the moisture content in the wood. And given the heavy rainfalls or the seasonality, the changed seasonality of the seasons there, they had seen that the quality of the wood that they use to fire and to produce heat, that has decreased because of the moisture. So they have done really a low investment, let's say. They have built more shades for the firewood that they are housing on their premises. So with this, that this wood is not exposed to all of the rainfalls that they really couldn't judge anymore. So that was a very simple measure. Another one that they have done is in relation to the transport of the tea leaves from the tea fields to the factory, basically. So also there, it was very difficult sometimes for them to anticipate when the rains would come. And so they said, okay, we need to better protect those tea leaves so that after the harvesting, they still have the best quality in order to enter into the processing at the factory. And so, yeah, they have really very, very simple measure. They have bought coverage for the tea leaves, which is being transported on the trucks. Another example from also this factory is in relation to the prolonged droughts. So not only rain has been impacted, but also the availability of water really. They have, in collaboration also with the National Tea Research Institute, they have come up with different varieties of teas. So of course, this is a very long-term measure. It takes a lot of time for these plants to regrow, but they are really switching to more to the varieties which are more resistant to climatic impacts. And at the same time, also, they have increased the number of shade trees that they have in the fields. So this is also, again, another very long-term impact, but because the sun hours have increased, and this impacts on basically the growing of the plant and the quality of the tea that can in the end be harvested. They have really invested into planting more of these shaded trees. So there you see also from the time dimensions, there are sometimes very quick things that can be done, but sometimes it, of course, adaptation does take some time for the effects to really show. Another example we have here from our project in Morocco, and this is when I talked earlier, for instance, about flooding. This is a real case. So here, this factory was located in an industrial zone. And given the increased occurrence of heavy rains, they had also experienced floods, which sometimes impacted on their storage on the premises. So they might have finished the production of clothing, they might have made it ready to be shipped and to go into the logistics of the value chain. And then a heavy rain would hit, the canals or the water drainage could not capture all of the water, and it would actually impact on their production in the storage places. So this is why here in this example, they have implemented a floodgate in order to not be impacted by this. So with the anticipation, of course, knowing that such a rain might come, they would install this on the needs basis. But such a floodgate, of course, has to be available. And if you just realize, okay, now it's raining, we need one, it's better to have it there on site already. Another easy quick fix, we didn't put this on pictures, of course, is that they simply increased the bottom roof, the bottom shelf. So they didn't store the packages that they had packed on the ground anymore, but they would really simply lift them up. So this is a no-cost thing, but in the end, it really helped them to keep the production there. Another from another company, also in the clothing sector in Morocco, is the ventilation systems that they have implemented. And here you see their roof. In Morocco, also we see that temperatures have continuously been higher. Sometimes very extreme heat waves. And so this company has reacted by upgrading their ventilation system as well as the insulation on the roof. And this is what I was referring to also earlier when talking about the impacts on employee wellness or welfare, so that, you basically don't sit in a room and are impacted by the heat, but there is actually a climate in which is more comfortable to work in. Again, in Kenya, but this time a different sector. Here we're in the flower sector in Kenya. This was a flower farm actually producing different types of roses and other types of flowers for export. And I just want to highlight one measure here, which you actually see on the photo. And this is in relation to the drip irrigation. And that is, of course, also a way of saving water. So it's not only about adaptation, but it's also in that sense good for the environment. But it also helps them to really point the water usage, and it's making it much more precise. You also see on the photo that they have the mulch to avoid water loss. So the plants, they can really thrive in an environment which is best for their growing conditions, basically. Then jumping to another example, again, from the textile sector. And here you see this is related to water management. With some factories, we have seen, for instance, that they were not connected to the water network, but they were reliant on the boreholes, basically, that they had drilled for themselves. And some of them over the past 10 years, this is really anecdotal evidence, but they told us, yes, the water situation has become, let's say, it has become more scarce, and some of the boreholes have dried out. Previously, you used to have 4, now there's only 1 left. So this is not the same factory here, but another factory they have implemented as a response also to the water program. They have implemented measures in order to better utilize the water. So it's really about reutilization, to use less water per product, with the aim to basically not be so reliant on the availability of externally sourced water, but to keep the water really in the cycle. And at the same time, they have combined this. So this is a strategic avenue for them, basically. They have combined this with new requirements from international buyers to better manage chemicals. So they didn't purely, let's say, respond to the need to do something on the water, but at the same time, they implemented something which helps them to better manage chemicals, to be less polluting, which is a requirement from international buyers. So really turning an adaptation measure also into something that is strategic for the company and helps them to ensure continuous access to markets. And then here, finally, we have also another simple example, the installation of LED lighting as well as rooftop solar. Because LED lighting, of course, uses less electricity, it is also less energy intensive than traditional lighting. And of course, the installation of rooftop solar very much pertains to the fact that it's renewable energy. It's basically there, the sun is shining, and it also reduces more the environmental footprint. And that, how is this related to climate change? We have seen that, for instance, the electricity supply sometimes has been unstable in some countries, where the grid, for instance, is also impacted by heat, where there could be, for instance, meltdowns of small wires, and that impacts sometimes on the factory electricity supply, where there have been frequent cuts, for instance, of the electricity, given also sometimes heavy rains impacts, for instance, that this makes the entire grid unstable. So this factory has really opted to become independent of this, and has opted to implement solar panels also with the environmental co-benefits that I have just mentioned. So again, making this also a strategic decision for the company. So those were a lot of the different examples, and they come from what you see here on the slides, from the implementation of the climate expert approach, which has been developed by GIZ, and which we, ITC, we have implemented in different projects in the meantime across many different developing countries. So you see here, we're active in this context in the MENA region, we're active in South America, we're active in Asia. So the approach that we're applying is really independent from, let's say, the geographic circumstances or the sectoral circumstances, but it's really applicable across many different needs of sectors of companies. This climate resilient approach that results in the identification of the measures that you have just seen runs over 4 different phases, and this is what you see here. So we really start by mapping out the climate impacts or the climate phenomena that we see. So really understanding how have weather patterns changed over the past years, and what effects does this have on companies, and what is the impact on them? Is there a positive impact, for instance? Are there opportunities or are there risks? And those are very much detailed in the second steps. So it's really about going deep into understanding, what does a heavy rain mean for a company? What does it mean that there are more sun hours? How does this affect, for instance, consumer demand? So based on this understanding, also, and Catherine earlier, she mentioned the hotspot analysis to really see where are the risks in the entire production chain. Based on this understanding, in step 3, it is about creating, coming up with adaptation measures. And those, in the beginning, they can be broad ideas. So this means we might come up with a measure to say, okay, let's implement solar energy for the entire factory. And we don't qualify, or we don't question this measure per se in the beginning. But what is, of course, very important is that there is not only, let's say, we're not only doing good for the climate or for the risk, but it also makes financial sense for the company. And this is why this is really the core of our approach. And we're doing a cost-benefit analysis. So on the one hand, we're weighing, okay, what does it cost to implement such a measure? How much investment is there in year 1? How much follow-up investment is there over the years? So is there maintenance, for instance? Is there any other employees that need to be hired in order to implement this? So what are the follow-up costs as well? And then we put this against the opportunities. So this could mean, is there additional revenue that the company can generate? Is there a potential to co-invest because the company was anyways going to do another measure? So all of these benefits we also weigh against the costs identified in the beginning. And based on this, we really come up with technical terms, with technical numbers, a net present value. We look at, okay, what is the return period of such a measure? And how much time does it basically take in order to repay it? Is it 1 year? Is it 10 years? And based on this financial data, then we only take the decision on whether the adaptation measure makes sense or whether it's be discarded. So once this decision is basically taken, all of these different measures, they come together in what we call an adaptation strategy for the company. So really moving from this perspective on addressing one single climate effect to broadening the picture up and thinking about, okay, how is this relevant from the strategic perspective for the company? How can these measures really contribute to the development, for instance, to access new markets, to find international or new buyers? And with this, we call basically the adaptation strategy, which also integrates then a communication strategy. So who do you need to inform in order to implement respective measures? Is it your employees internally? Is it externally a buyer? Is it externally a financier? Because you need to access finance in order to implement such a measure. So this is really the big picture of the 4 steps. Typically, this is done in a larger coaching program in which different companies can participate. And this is what you see on the next slide. So the 4 steps you see here from the previous slide, you see them here in dark blue. And we've built a program around this to not really make this a pure, only the company does it, but to really engage the ecosystem around it. So people integrated and involved in creating such an adaptation strategy are, of course, experts that know what they're talking about, that know the industry, but that also know the topic of climate change, so that they are really able to give expert advice. It's also related to service providers around companies who can, for instance, supply the related materials that are needed in order to implement measures. What are the financiers that provide finance if a measure is really high and maybe the company cannot finance it themselves? So we start out by inviting all of these stakeholders in we call it an awareness raising workshop about what it means, about the risks, about the benefits of becoming climate resilient. Then based on the results of this workshop, we really go with the companies and their coaches through this 4-step coaching program that I've introduced on the previous slide. And after each company has produced an adaptation strategy, we then, of course, move into implementation. And this is here what you see under step number 6, and in step number 7, the monitoring. So then a strategy is always nice to have, you will say, but of course it's about really what is being implemented afterwards and what challenges do come up on the way, and how can we solve those challenges so that the strategy really is implemented in the end. So this is the entire process. And what is just key to say is that really, again, the business case is at the core of all of this. We see in the environment of different businesses that access to finance is, of course, always a question, but that new opportunities in relation to green finance, they are coming up. So we see that companies are forced to move due to international requirements, for instance, from their suppliers, and then they're asking themselves, but where does the money come for this? And there we see, okay, there are different banks. There are, for instance, also impact investors that are geared to catering for these demands. So the materials, the adaptation strategy that we produce is also geared towards catering for these demands from financiers who want to see, okay, how is this adaptation measure actually becoming relevant for the company to generate new revenues? How is this measure actually contributing also to other environment-related targets that a green finance provider might require? So really calculating the business case is not only relevant for the company per se, but it's also relevant for external stakeholders that might want to finance these types of measures. And what we have basically seen also in our projects is that companies have been successful in accessing finance. Here you see 3 different examples from our project in Kenya. There are 2 companies that are active more in the vegetables and processing sector, and 1 company which is more in the tea sector. And they have really approached impact investors with adaptation measures, and they have been successful in obtaining the required financing for this. So here you see Myonga Fresh Greens, for instance. They wanted to implement in a mobile solar drying truck in order to reduce waste, but also, in order to reduce the energy footprint. And they have been successful in attracting 100 British pounds as an investment. The same for Their Limited, also similar for Kentaste in terms of drought-resistant seed varieties for farmers. One that we have mentioned earlier also on the pictures. And there is, for instance, and that is really one of these green finance opportunities that have come up in the last years. In Kenya, you have the Agrify Challenge Fund, which funds exactly these types of measures. So it's just an example to show, okay, on the company side, we see that companies are successful in raising funds for this. And on the financier side, we also see that funds are really being made available for these types of measures. So with this, what remains to say from our side is that ITC, this approach that I've very quickly introduced to you, this is an approach that we want to make available to everybody that really wants to use it. And we are doing this via our e-learning course called Becoming a Climate Resilient SME. And this is available for free for anyone on ITC's SME Trade Academy. Here, I think on the next slide, you will even have the link for it. This course is for free. It's the first time it will start this month on the 28th of June, and it's targeted at SMEs as well as experts that want to work with SMEs on this topic. Very important to say, it's free of charge. So you can really hop in and take what you think is interesting for you and leave the rest if you want. It's 6 hours over 2 weeks. And so the time investment is really overseeable. In case there are questions, this course is also tutored. So if you have a question, you can post it basically in the discussion forum, which is also hosted on the platform. So we'd be happy to see if this was interesting, what we already presented to you. Please do tune in again on June 28th. And we're happy to go deeper into this topic. So with this, let me hand over to Kriti from SheTrades. And on behalf of Catherine and myself, it was very good to speak to you. If there are questions that have come up, please do feel free to contact us. And Kriti will talk about the next steps. Please also feel free to raise your questions in the panel, for instance, that is coming up in the next week. Thank you so much.
Annegret and Anne-Catherine, firstly, thank you so much for such an enriching, such rich content at this webinar. And I think, that my messaging here will be that we all need to remember that, as you said, no one is impervious to the impact of climate change, right? So we need to make sure that we're assessing the risks, the gaps, the impact, and we are taking preventative as well as proactive measures. So a big thanks to both of you again. Just before I also go to the next session, I also want to highlight that this e-learning course is extremely, extremely important. And it will be offered to you as part of this package under SheTrades Global. So you will be accessing this on SME Trade Academy on the June 28th. But before that, don't forget that we'll have a panel next week on environmental sustainability and climate change. So this is the panel where we'll have our experts, but also with them private sector partners and women entrepreneurs for a more interactive and dynamic session. So I'm sure you have a lot of questions today. Hold on to them and join us again next week. And of course, coming up in July, we are focusing again on COVID-19 and digitalization. So don't forget to register for Road to SheTrades Global. Can we just move on to the next slide? Yes. So just a final note from me before we wrap up. I know we're almost done, but make sure that you're aware of the 2 different registration links that we have. So starting with the link for Road to SheTrades Global, it's right there on your screen. We'll also be sharing this with you, but there's also a different link to register for SheTrades Global Dubai, which will be happening from the 17th to 19th of October in Dubai at Expo 2020. So make sure you're registering for both of these links, and you can keep getting updates and information on everything that's happening from our end. So I think on behalf of the Road to SheTrades Global team, this is it. Any final comments from our speakers before we wrap up?
Well, it was really a pleasure to join SheTrades on this global movement. And we're really looking forward also to the other events and to really engage also with the people that have come to join us for this webinar today as part of the upcoming opportunities. Thank you really very much for having us today.
Thank you both of you. We will of course speak with you again next week, and we hope to see both of you again, as well as all the participants have tuned with us today. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone, and we'll speak with you soon. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.